That makes sense.
Not sure she's gonna come. Jody is traveling. Jim said he was coming. And Murphy was traveling. We start? Start?
Sure, yeah. Sure.
All right. Good evening, everybody. Welcome back. Unfortunately, Becky had a family emergency today, so the first item on today's agenda was going to be a review of the stakeholder meetings that we had over the last month or so. We will postpone that until our first meeting in June. Although if you are interested, I encourage you to go back. Becky also produced very detailed, nice sort of 1.5 page minutes of each of the sessions. And also a number of folks submitted stakeholder comments, and that's all on the website. But Becky will provide that overview at our meeting on June 6th. I've put in front of, I've given you all, and will be on the website, a few things, the schedule of the next 3 months, some of the presentations we'll be having as we dig a little deeper into some specific topics. Starting today with Professors Rubin and Oxier from the Urban Institute. Kim and Mike will be talking about fines and fees, a key issue that we haven't really touched on much, but definitely has implications for the district's revenue flow, both its adequacy and its stability and its progressivity. And then Richard will be talking about the concept of tax expenditures, which we've talked about a lot of individual tax expenditures in passing, but I think we haven't really gotten our heads around the tax expenditures. So I want to make sure we're all grounded in that idea and thinking about how to analyze them, because a number of the proposals that we'll be bringing to you to think about relate to various tax expenditures. I've also put in your packet our current list of policy proposals. We've merged in all of the great ideas that lots of stakeholders and members of the general public fed into us through the public meetings, through our stakeholder meetings, and through uploading documents to our website. I think we're up to 120 something. And we are carefully going through all of those. And they're really presented here in no particular order, except we've sorted them by alphabetical order by the tax that they apply to. Some of them are big, some of them are small. This doesn't really distinguish them. If you look at them and you're like, I do not know what any of these things mean, don't worry. That's our job, and we will be fleshing them all out over the coming months, and particularly starting in September as we start to make decisions. I think that's everything. Anything else we need to go about to start off? All right, so again, since we don't have Becky, we'll be a little bit ahead of agenda today, but well, plenty to talk about here. I'm going to turn it over to Kim and Mike.
Okay, great. Thank you for letting us talk to you about this. First, I wanted to introduce Priya Sarathi Jones, who is from the Fines and Fees Justice Center and knows way more about this subject. So if we get into trouble and why this is important, I'm hoping she will contribute to our conversation. There are a number of people in DC who are doing a lot of good work. I feel like some of the advocates were sort of critical in getting rid of the clean hand laws about people losing their licenses, their driver's licenses, if they had outstanding fines and fees, which feels like a really big step forward in terms of equity and helping people not have unduly draconian consequences from having some tickets. So we're going to go through this. First one. I think we're going to do fines and fees, and then we're going to do tax expenditures. So feel free to interrupt if you want to, or we can do it. How many people are online? Is it better if we hold questions?
I don't think we have any commissioners.
So
online.
I am happy to be interrupted. If it's something that will take us off track, I might say, well, get back to that later. But as we go, we can start. So first some definitions. What are fines and fees? And I'm also going to include forfeitures or forfeits, which is another thing that gets thrown around. So fines are usually imposed on a person for the purpose of punishment and something deterrence, so that's more questionable, of undesirable or unwanted behaviors. So if you're trying to get people, oh, you stuck? So if you want to keep people from speeding or parking illegally, one way we do that is by having tickets issued to try and discourage that behavior, because if not, it won't necessarily keep people from doing that. Fees are typically imposed to cover costs of a government service or the cost of sort of dealing with, if you're going to put it in terms of a fine, in addition to sort of processing it. So if we think about fees are for electronic monitoring, there are court costs, like if you actually have a public defender, you could be charged for having that public defender, which seems a little backwards. Fees can also be about things that go beyond criminal justice. So if we think about residential parking, passes are typically thought of as fees. So fees are things that are for services. Garbage collection could also be thought of as fees. And the other thing is there are things called forfeitures, which is the seizure of property that was used in the committing of a crime. So think of it, if somebody is stopped for having for transporting drugs, they not only take the drugs and charge them with the crime, they can also grab the car and keep the car. If money is sort of related to drug offenses or things like that, we're mainly going to be talking about traffic, but there are a whole bunch of things that go beyond that in the criminal justice system that you might want to think about. In part, we're going to end up talking about traffic a lot just because it feels like in the new budget, the fact that we're increasing the number of ATE cameras feels like it's a time when we want to think about who's paying those tickets, who's getting those tickets, and whether it is equitable and whether it's doing what we want it to do in the city or in the district. Okay, so how much revenues do fines and fees generate in DC? So this is where we're going to sort of step back and where your eyes might glaze over a little bit. So the pie chart, that is the total general fund revenue in the district. So in 2022, there was $9.8 billion in revenues, $8.5 billion in the general fund. Part of that is there is money that is not part of the general fund. So this is basically showing you that the large blue section, that is sort of our general taxes. Then non-tax revenue is where fees and fines sit, and that's what's in the table. So we're going to get into that in a minute. But then there's also dedicated taxes and special purpose non-tax revenue. So those last two are not necessarily going into the general fund, they're going to other dedicated funds. And you'll correct me if I get any of the budgets right.
Good, so.
And so when we're talking about this, it's sort of important to sort of think about how it all fits together, especially when we're thinking about something like these new ATE cameras that are going to put more money into the general fund. So it's sort of increasing that part.
But each of these funds can have fines, fees within it. They don't crosswalk to,
Some do. Like, I feel like
but this is more like accounting, that it's not really policy.
right. So, but in the non-tax revenue so the non-tax revenue for the general fund is what we're largely going to be focused on. But I just sort of want to make sure, like, we at least cover that there's some things that feel like fines or fees or costs that are related to criminal justice that show up in other dedicated funds.
Gotcha.
Like if we start there, something like if somebody isn't paying their child support and that money is being collected by the city through garnishments typically, that money ends up going to fund the DA's budget, right? So there is money that's coming into the city related to child support payments, but it is now dedicated not into the general fund, but it's going into one of these special dedicated funds that is related to criminal justice. Most of what we're talking about is going to fit into this fines and forfeitures. Do you want to go through the?
Most interesting fun.
Yeah,
Rabbit.
I didn't know there were other sections of budget.
Sounds.
Okay. Okay, so I'm going to keep going.
So there are some fines and fees within the special purpose.
There is some fines and fees within this special purpose. They're not very much. So I went through and was looking at things that might be related to fines and fees that fit into that special purpose non-tax revenue, or is that right?
Yeah, there's
I was looking through and I feel like it's less than 10% of that money. If we look at sort of criminal justice, but don't hold me to that. So it is $740 million and I got about 65 million that seemed like it was related to criminal justice or fines and fees in that non-general fund dedicated revenue. So what are we talking about? So we're talking about $451 million in general purpose non-tax revenue. Fines and forfeitures make up about 30% of that. The majority of that ends up being related to things like speeding cameras, traffic fines, red light cameras. So part of the reason we're going to end up focusing on it is because there's a fair amount of money there. And we can also look at the equity and try and think about what it means if we're raising more money using these non-tax sources. Other things that fit into non-tax revenue that you might want to think about that we're not going to talk about as much. There are licenses and permits. This is sort of fees for building structures, motor vehicle registrations count as non-tax revenue. Charges for services include things like emergency ambulances and parking permits and fees. We might want to think about whether it is fair to charge for things like ambulances and emergency services, or whether that's setting up equity concerns for different parts of or different communities. There's also corporate recordation fees, which is, I think, when corporations register.
That's gonna be another different.
Okay, fine. I won't go there. And then if we think about miscellaneous other revenues, this is where it gets kind of fun. I believe, so there are pilots where payments in lieu of taxes for water and sewer authority there, but it also includes money that's collected by the CCU, which includes delinquent fees and fines. So some of the money that's coming from fees and fines, if it's collected late, will not sit in fines and forfeits, but part of it is going to be sitting in this miscellaneous other revenue. So when we end up talking about things like whether we should forgive delinquent debt, it might end up being in a different part of the budget, but it's still something we want to think about whether, you know, that just is money that we might not be getting, and it might be a useful thing to write off. Other places have found that if you sort of write off that delinquent debt, it can help families immeasurably in that it cleans up their credit ratings. And it isn't actually costing places that much money because they're not really collecting it. Okay, how has revenue from fines and fees changed in DC? So the portion of local revenue from fines and fees is has been about 2%. It's gone down to 1.6%. That blip up starting in 2025. So the stuff after 2023 is forecast based on the budget, and it is based on the fact that there are going to be more of those cameras. Like, it's assuming that those cameras are put into place and they are raising revenue. Okay, so while it is a small amount of revenue, the fact that we are thinking about doubling the amount of revenue that the district is getting from these fines and fees might be problematic.
And by fines and fees in this instance, we are just talking about traffic fines.
Okay, thank you.
Do you know how firm that is? I mean, there's got to be some economist, right, who specializes in traffic camera fines.
Well, so there are interesting ways that we're going to talk about afterward, that if you want to put them in and thinking about what it is you're hoping to accomplish, what is the right level of fees, or what the fine, like, there have been cases in California where they put in an ability to pay, where they've actually raised more money.
But I'm asking beyond, before threshold is how much can you, if you take the whole population that drives,
Yeah,
how much can you really expected value expect to get? And then you can talk about how you're gonna discount it and trim it. But I mean, is this a realistic number or not?
Yes,
I
Yeah,
think
so
it's realistic.
I'm happy to
Yeah.
describe.
Okay,
There's 3 or 4 things we were worried about in this proposal. The first was just the logistic capacity of Department of Transportation and others to mount these. I guess unlike in past efforts before I was here, some of that hadn't been worked out. At least now there's a procurement contract that's actually completed. And some reasonable schedules to deploy over the next 6 to 9 months. That's a marked change from, I guess, the past. So there is at least a mechanical capacity to put them on. But once you start thinking about the cameras, there's a couple of key factors. First is, let's say they're working fine. What's the likelihood you capture the fines that you actually levy? And that's the cross-border problem that you've read about in the press. That's a significant issue. On average, it's about 70%. And so that was the starting point of our estimate, was 70%. But we also know that there's a decay. Over time, each camera's bringing in fewer dollars. And we've had enough in the district that we were able to have a rough idea. If it's a busy arterial, the decay isn't as fast. If it's a smaller road. And so we had decay factors based upon their deployment. So you start with 70%, then you go down from there. We haven't watched a whole life cycle, whatever that means. And by the way, we all hope that there's a big decay factor, because that means people are not going through red lights or going too fast. So in the end, just a straight up policy wonk as we are, we're hoping we go to 0, and we'll be the first to forecast 0 as soon as we see that happening. But we do expect a decay, but that's a big guess. And based on some analyses we've done, we have a reasonable comfort with this, but we'll see. If these are proliferated so densely such that the entire population begins to react to them more quickly, then the revenue forecast will go down. No doubt about it.
it
But
will
those-
also, like, for certain parts of the population, if they end up getting more tickets, you might see them paying less because they can't afford to clear it. And so part of it is this the right way that we should set it up, especially where these cameras tend to be? And are we being unduly harmful to certain parts of our population in a way that isn't affordable? And if we're doing it because of public safety, there isn't necessarily a lot of good evidence that that the cameras are going to make it safer. That the drivers that are the most risky and that are doing things that are the most dangerous aren't necessarily deterred by these red light cameras or the
And a lot of the driving won't be captured by this, because it's on national park roads.
Well, that was like the Rock Creek. right. Well, it mostly goes to general fund. Some of it is supposed to go provision zero, but that is becoming less likely in what is being proposed. So I'll get to that in a second too.
Just a quick follow-up, and Glenn, maybe you can answer this. Do we do any analysis of the demographics of the people who are given the tickets?
We don't.
And for instance, you
I-
know,
I have some slides on it, but
so I'm
No,
almost done. You know, so, you know, there is an increased tendency to hold people unaccountable based on income. It's just to get out of jail free card.
Mhm.
If you have a certain income, it's get out of jail. If you're a certain age, it's get out of jail. And so if we are finding that it's a certain age category, for instance, that has recently seen consequences reduced, and they are therefore more inclined to do things, and yet these cameras either aren't working or they're not enforced. This is interesting. And this is, the next thing I'm gonna say is total heresy. But you know who I almost get hit by on a regular basis? I live in DuPont, bicyclists. You know, and God forbid that we hold bicyclists accountable for their actions. God forbid. But I'm telling you, I have seen it and I have been the victim of it. And if you don't look both ways, there can be a bike lane right in front of you and they will either be on the sidewalk
Amen.
or coming in the opposite direction.
That's what I'm
And
loving.
look, I'm a fan. I think people should have as many modes as possible. But if we want to talk about equity, that's impartiality and fairness. That's what it is. There is no impartiality when it comes to privileging cyclists, which is a vehicle that can injure me just as easily as a car.
Do we feel it's like this?
So when you talk about equity, what is the formula, Glenn, for the placement of these cameras over the 8 wards? Because I think that has to be taken into consideration.
there,
If you've got a.
well, I
answer,
feel like
Rita.
there,
Because I know what the conversation is going to be,
Yeah.
that the cameras are placed in communities where mostly African.
there are more cameras in like Ward 8
That's what I thought.
and less.
Because all the literature shows, because of all the history, all the traffic that's high-speed traffic
you
is
wanna-
in your poorer areas, so therefore you have the cameras, which is just compounding the.
When the cameras could be in the areas where.
But we're also
Right.
seeing it in parking tickets. So it's not just the traffic cameras, right? We're seeing disproportionate parking tickets being issued in some of the same wards, which we don't necessarily have the same.
My
kinds
office is
of
in Ward
conversations.
3 and I park and I see people park and they know they can run in and stay a half an hour, come out, there's no ticket.
That's also,
But-
like the legacy of stop and frisk. It
So,
was used as a tool to.
right, and so
Stuff.
that's where some of this gets right. So first, I just sort of want to put this in some context. So this is sort of what DC looks like compared to other cities. So in census of governments data, it's about 1.5. So it's not necessarily that different than other big cities on a percent of general fund money. It is really high on a per capita basis, but part of that, and that's like DC is that top bar, that $261. Part of that is because other cities have states that are also levying traffic tickets, right? So in DC, because it's the city and the state, it makes it bigger. But if we lowered it by the 37% average that other places have states collect these fines and fees, it would still be $164, which is still much higher than New York City and all the other ones that are at $116. So we are raising more money on a per capita basis from this revenue source compared to other major cities.
And couldn't a big argument be because once again, our revenue structure is distorted, so we're gonna squeeze the parts we can squeeze because we don't have access to half the damn revenue.
Yes, but give me a minute and we will like talk about sort of where the problem with that is if we think part of The issue is we're not,
excusing it,
right,
I'm just
Yes.
explaining it.
yes.
Was it on, indicate that, court fees, included in this?
Court fees, so this fines and fees index, which is by the National Center for Access to Justice. Okay.
We paid for, what was it, I thought that was all covered.
So it is covered, but we will charge people, but then the money goes to the feds? Is that right?
I mean, we're not charging them, but our residents are being charged. The federal government takes care of a lot of what we get from vendor fees. Or like the money goes to them, like service, but like these residents have to pay it.
I got a question, real quick question. So to David's point earlier, so there's a proliferation of cameras in Ward 8, Ward 7. But is there a reliable data collection system that says who's paying them?
Yeah.
Who's paying the fees? Do we know who's paying the fines?
And I don't,
Because I think there's a supposition that there are more cameras, which means that that community is paying more, which may be true, but if you don't have any data to really support that, then I'm,
so we know where the fees are issued. But I don't know if we have information about who is getting the tickets. I feel like we're hoping to, we do.
Who's,
We know it is disproportionately also receiving the tickets, and the cameras are more heavily overheads, which makes sense because it's frequently, but there's a lot of policies and investigations that have already looked at who's receiving them, who can't pay them, when they receive them, and what's the, who's receiving more.
do we know who's requesting them, just out of curiosity? Because I'll go back a few years and recall that, to, I think, the mayor's point, in community 7 and 8, where we had a policy where the police could not chase a suspect,
Outside of the district.
period. They're not allowed to pursue,
Okay.
okay? And so it took about 6 nanoseconds for people to understand that they could simply outrun the police. And so having the police land up in your front yard was such a common occurrence for the people I represented at 7-8. It was a daily event. So it was the communities that were demanding this as an option because the police were powerless to stop it. So that's why I want to know who, just curious,
And I don't know.
who is getting the tickets and who is paying for them. And my last point, there's no, I mean, the Orcas of Delphi, the Jedi Council, that is our city council, they're not sitting around thinking like, what should be the right fee? They're like, how much money do we need? And that's how, I don't know, do you all recall when we charged $500 for fines if you had one of those plastic covers on your license plate that was supposed to avoid, the cameras? So we, we put a $500 fine, the science that went into that, we needed a certain amount of money. That's it.
I do not know. I do know that in other places,
Scientific budget.
there are ways that you can keep, like, there are ways of making the cameras and making this more affordable for populations that are earning less money in a way that might actually increase the amount of money being brought into the city because people could actually afford to pay their tickets, which is some of the evidence from California. And that there are ways of using technology to try and make this more straightforward from everybody gets a ticket that is worth this much to possibly taking into account the fact that a $200 ticket is a much larger part of somebody's income if they earn less money than if they don't. And we have a lot of differences in sort of how much people are earning.
So this would be, in essence, an ability to pay money.
Exactly. The other thing that's worth noting is that our cameras are much more expensive than in Virginia and Maryland. Right now, nothing else going on. Do I want to skip ahead to how does this work in the district, or should we go through why it is? Why don't we talk a little bit about why it's getting more scrutiny in different places?
We got the,
Yes.
emergency ambulance. So when you call 911, they come, that's the fee. For that.
If you get transported in an ambulance, you are charged a fee. I think they bill you.
They do.
Except
That busted my knee.
if you're Medicaid.
I busted my knee, you get a fee. You do, you get a charge.
Right. Like I was in an Uber that was hit by another car and I needed somebody to come get my dog anyway. And I was gonna go in the ambulance
Yeah, they
and the
say-
police were like,
They
you should
send
just have your friends go take you to
They
the,
send
like,
you a bill, yeah. Yeah, they do send you a bill. And it's high too.
$1,000 plus mileage.
1,000.
It's $1,000 plus mileage.
I don't think that applies to Medicaid.
well, if you're a Medicaid patient, I feel like Medicaid would,
So if you're below 200% of poverty, then you're Medicaid eligible, therefore, that is funded as a part of the either emergent or non-emergent medical transportation. So we pay for folks in non-emergency situations to be transported to their physician as well as emergency. So for people above 200%, it could be an issue.
The reason I raised that because a few years ago, there was a story about the overuse 911, 911 to take people to the hospital. And one of them doesn't appear to people paid for it. That was the complaint, that was the overuse of the service. I never heard any fees coming back from that overuse.
and it might be because of the Medicaid or how it's,
You definitely have more ambulance traffic here in DC than any other city I've ever seen. But you walk down the street in New York, you'll see every day, you'll see 5 ambulances.
yeah. Where I live, you see more than that, but.
Yeah. It's just interesting.
Okay, so why do we care? Why are we talking about this here rather than, just talking about property tax, sales tax, other taxes? Partly across the country, the range of criminal and civil fines has grown over the last 20 years. And in part, things that had been paid for with general tax revenues are now being paid for from fees and fines. And so we're sort of switching who is responsible for paying for certain things. The other part of this is there's a lot of inequity of who is charged these fees and fines, who gets stopped, who gets the tickets. And then as places may have been prioritizing revenue over public safety, like Ferguson, that just amplifies the problem. So like Ferguson, Missouri was raising a disproportionate amount of its money. And it was key that it was happening, there was a racialized aspect to this. The other part of this that gets problematic, and this isn't as much about the cameras as when you have, an increased need for tickets and people stopping drivers, is the consequences of interacting with the justice system can be terrible for certain parts of our population. If we think about what it means to be a Black or a brown man and interacting with the police in this country, it can lead to truly terrible consequences. The other part of this that gets kind of problematic, and this comes back to all sorts of taxes where we notionally are charging money to try and discourage a behavior, but then we rely on those revenues, is you end up with inefficient and insufficient sources of revenues for the programs you're trying to pay for. If we think about things like increasing cigarette taxes to notionally discourage people from smoking, but then we're using that to fund childcare programs. If you end up having your programs dependent on these activities that you're notionally trying to get people to stop doing, it means that you end up with shortfalls, which could actually lead to an increase in other fees and fines that you basically then pass. And so in other places, you can see a $35 traffic ticket end up with a whole bunch of fees to pay for all sorts of other programs that are really good programs, like victim relief or paying for the courts. And it is not proportionate to what the crime was or what the infraction was, but because that's how they're paying for their justice system, you end up getting these bad incentives. And so part of this also comes down to what are the services we should have and who should pay for them. And if we're thinking about things like criminal justice or our justice system, that is a public good. That helps everybody. And it seems ridiculous to think that only the people who are like caught up in it are going to end up having to pay to keep it running, given their benefits to everybody. And then the other part of it is, as we have these debts, especially if people can't afford to pay them, and they start doubling and they start accumulating interest, it can basically totally derail somebody's life. Like, it is better now that we don't take away somebody's driver's license if they have outstanding traffic tickets. But it could have been that people were actually not able to get to their jobs because they lost their license, or they were driving without a license, so they were possibly incurring more fees. And so just sort of thinking about what this debt could be doing to somebody's like financial well-being and how it all fits into the system is important. And just sort of thinking about what we think is equitable and understanding better who is paying them and whether there are off ramps to try and make these fines more affordable if people have less revenue.
Well, what's the best argument for a user fee? There is an argument that the classical economists would use.
For user fees, you're paying for the services you get. You know, I have somebody collect my garbage. I should pay for that. And that is a one-for-one thing. The problem is, and you know, there is some externality in that if my garbage, you know, piles up, it makes it worse for everybody around me. But if we think about sort of who the justice system serves, it is the population as a whole. Like, I came to this from work on higher education.
I'm just saying that there are some user fees that make sense and some that don't.
Yes.
Some make sense.
Yeah, like,
And let's be clear, these fines are not paid for the entire criminal justice system. They're 1.5% on a population, if you let me finish, that
Yes.
by and large has had its tax burden demonstrably reduced over the last 30 years. It has in the city through any number of ways. We have privileged lower income people through certain tax policies, all right? And so while the percentage of taxes paid by the bottom quarter has continued to shrink, it has, this isn't a huge percentage of our budget. And so it's not like for a population that's had its burden decrease, this isn't a disproportionate amount of money. Let me finish. I don't know how the CFO speculates for purposes of revenue estimates, who's going to get the tickets, what their income is, and who will pay and who won't. Not the least of which, if you've tried to get a building permit in this city in the last year, it is a 6-month to 8-month proposition if you're lucky and you pay an expedited fee for the privilege of not getting one. If you think these folks are going to be able to figure out how much to charge you and then collect, and he's going to be able to build a budget upon it, it's a fantasy land.
California is doing it. I
They're
understand.
also going broke.
Can I just, yes, it is not everybody who is being subject to these fines and fees. But when you hear stories of people who have actually had their lives derailed because of some of these fines and fees in other places, it can break your heart. Like, and again, partly I am new to this. I come to this because the people who do work on fees and fines were interested in how it had to do with budgets. But I also came to this from a background where I do a lot of work on higher education. And if we think tuition, that charging people tuition to go to college might be unfair because it might leave them with too much debt for what's going to go on in their future. The thought that we might have young people in our country that we are burdening with debt related to the criminal justice system that is going to negatively impact their lives feels like, if we have any question of equity, you want to think about equity, some understanding who is subject to these costs, whether there's an off-ramp or a way to keep it from necessarily totally burdening somebody. I am not saying nobody can afford to pay this. I get these tickets, I pay it, I don't even think about it. I can pay $100, I can pay $200, I can recognize the fact that I should learn to go slower when I am going down that tunnel on K Street to go to 66. But I don't have to think about whether if I pay a fine for $100, does that mean I'm not buying food? I don't have to think about the fact that if I can't afford to pay that $100 fine this month, it's gonna be $200 within 60 days.
Okay, let's keep going.
Okay. Okay,
So rather an argument over the policy as opposed to just.
fine, well, go back to, how does this work in the district? So part of this is just getting some facts. There are more facts about, we have 62% of traffic fines were issued in neighborhoods where Black residents made up at least 70% of the population, right? This is sort of our ward 7 and 8 topic, and the average median income was below $50,000. Parking tickets issued in Black neighborhoods were nearly double compared to white neighborhoods, even though predominantly Black neighborhoods have less than a third of the city's driving age residents. So I don't know whether that is because they're being targeted or whether there are more people there parking wrong, but those numbers seem inequitable. Flat ticket amounts can impact families differently. If you have a $4,000 monthly income, a $200 ticket is worth 5% of your monthly income. If that doubles to $400, that's suddenly 10% of your monthly income going to pay for a ticket and not pay for other things. Whereas the median family the median white district family, it would be 1.5% of their monthly income, which would, if you doubled it, it would be 3%, right? So it's just figuring out how we deal with this. The other thing to point out is for tickets that aren't paid, there's a lot of talk about tickets not being paid. DC has a relatively low unpaid ticket rate, which is 30%, which is low compared to a number of other places. 90% of those outstanding tickets are linked to vehicles registered outside of DC that we don't have a way of enforcing.
Wait a minute, on that point, do other states have a way of enforcement?
The difference is that if you're in California, the likelihood that you live outside of California and you're getting that ticket.
Likelihood, just those that, an absolute number, if you live in North Carolina, get a ticket from Virginia, how do they?
I don't think they're generally reciprocal, Priya, do you know?
New York and New Jersey would be a great example.
Yes. Most of these tickets are outside, I know we found up on. But is it possible to work a deal with?
I think we sought that.
We tried
Unsuccessful.
and we're unsuccessful. They said no. Yeah. No, if we could get reciprocity, because a lot of the outstanding tickets are actually on those vehicles and they know that they don't necessarily have the same consequences.
Well, there's a way to do that, you can show them they come to the district.
Well, and that would be about, you could like if there were enough tickets or enough fees, you could try and seize the car. But you might want them based on like the number of infractions, not the amount of debt that's sitting there, right? So part of this is trying to differentiate between the kinds of infractions and trying to penalize and take seriously the things that feel like they're really serious. People speeding and the people who are killing people in Rock Creek Park are different than the person who's sort of going through the red light camera a little too fast and has one ticket, right? So if we think about the numbers of tickets or the types of infractions differently.
Isn't there license plate reader technology? I mean, let's assume that Department of Public Works were to put license plate readers on public cars, and as they drive them around the city, they would be able to identify someone in real time that had an infraction. Is that not possible?
We could if we.
And there are ways, are there not?
Technologically, you could, and you could use money that we're raising from this specifically.
Well, if we are really interested in equity, that means impartial and fair. That means people who, where they get a fine, they should pay it. If we have technology to do it, it's worth considering. I mean, if you can put a red light camera someplace, why couldn't you put a license reader at the same destination.
Are these really topics we're gonna be addressing?
No.
in the report?
I feel like the kinds of things that we might address are whether there's an ability to pay and whether the level of fines maybe should be reduced because of affordability. Right, so,
Well, there's, you know, in fairness, though, we're looking at tax administration. This is the administration of a fee.
okay,
I wonder if we could get through the presentation and then open up for questions so that everybody gets a fair shot at asking them. And also, it's hard to hear when people start having kind of these roundabout conversations and multiple people are talking.
okay. Are we next? So the other thing that is
Well, there's two different
interesting,
ways of doing it, you know, so I don't think we're cutting anybody's time off. Go ahead.
well, we have extra, but I want to make sure Erica and other people who are listening, I don't know if there are other people listening too, who can actually understand.
Affordability and all fair, but at the bottom line, 90% of the tickets outstanding that is Columbia. We're not talking about it from the people in the district. Because of those equity in terms of tickets.
But we
got to figure, support the mechanism to get the money moved.
But there's still the cost to the people who are in the district who might not be able to afford it.
That's your point to that.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Okay, so the other part that's interesting is there isn't evidence that higher fines improve street safety or change driver behavior. There isn't a lot of evidence that people are thinking about it when they're actually driving. It might be that if we have more fines, maybe they will slow down if there's a camera on every street, but we have not found evidence of that across the country, that it goes directly there. What does improve public safety, and DC is starting to do some of this, like if we reduce speed limits, if we redesign roadways, if we put in sort of barriers, that all can actually slow things down if you put in sort of crosswalks where people are crossing the street. You know, and the DC Council has discussed using the ATE funds for Vision Zero. Right now, the money that goes for Vision Zero is the amount after a certain amount is raised and goes into the general fund.
$99 million.
$99 million.
Really doesn't, I would say more, but I don't think it really ever reaches that much, or maybe a little bit of.
And when we have the additional money coming in, it is now earmarked not to go into Vision Zero, but like, I thought the proposal was to keep it all in the general fund. Now I don't want to push this too hard because personally, like, I feel like if we actually have the money in the general fund, it means that there is less incentive for different divisions or departments to want to use more of this. Like the parts where we sometimes get into trouble are when the money sort of sits in the police. Like if that's used to fund the police, it gives them an incentive to stop more cars and, you know, issue more tickets. So having the money not sit in the agency that is issuing the tickets is good, but if we actually are trying to impact street safety, then maybe we want to target money that will help with street safety. And then another point, and this is a point Priya made to me the other day, is if we focus not on sort of getting all the money from the fines from every camera, but sort of think about the people who are repeat offenders for driving dangerously, who have multiple tickets outstanding, which might be those drivers in Maryland and Virginia who are basically going very fast through the district to get home and realize that they don't have an incentive for necessarily paying it. Like if we could figure out a way to try and target the dangerous drivers rather than everybody who is stopped by the camera, that might be a way of incentivizing Virginia and Maryland to do things that are more coordinated.
Do you know how many of the tickets are of the temporary tag nature? Because there's no way to trace temporary tags. I mean, I could sketch one out right now. And so
I do not know.
Just bear with me, because if we have, let's assume, and this is an issue, depending on where you are, a lot of temporary tags, and people who are driving dangerously, who will not be accountable, who will not pay tickets? Do we have any idea of how much of our tickets are these unaccountable ghost drivers with these temporary tags, which can last for decades, honestly?
And I don't know, but part of it is figuring out.
They may be our most dangerous drivers. Again, this is all helpful to know, but I appreciate the presentation.
But part of this is also just trying to figure out, there are the people who we think might be causing the trouble that we feel like we want to penalize or punish and stop. But there are also the people who might be caught up and have their financial life kind of hijacked because they have some of these costs. And that's what we're trying hard to try and have not happen, right? So there are the
tiered system where the second ticket or the third ticket costs more. Give people an opportunity to make a mistake and learn, and then the tickets go up.
and we can do that. So that's sort of here, I'm talking about some of the reforms that we have in other places. So California canceled outstanding debt, repealed 40 county court fees, backfilled $65 million in lost local revenues, right? So an advantage that DC has from other places is the fact that our state and local funds are integrated. So it could be easy to shift things away from these fees and fines if we have revenues. This would be a lot more compelling 2 years ago than right now, possibly. There also is, programs in place where people, when they actually get on the app to pay their ticket, can indicate whether they are eligible for certain public funds, public programs, or list what their income is and have their ticket reduced automatically. They don't have to go to courts. Like in many places, there are ability to pay rules in place, but they require you going to court, which can trigger certain things. If we actually have it in the app where people are paying their tickets, so it is more automatic, then it might make it easier for people to pay. And California also found that the amount of revenue they were collecting went up when they gave people a way to have their tickets reduced. And Priya, you were involved, or? Other things that have been shown to be effective: Phoenix, Birmingham, Durham all forgive old traffic debt. If debt isn't collected by a certain point, you're not going to collect it. The costs of trying to collect it are pretty high. If we just wipe it out, it can get it off people's records, and it isn't necessarily costing that much money. And then the other place where we've seen a lot of activity, and it's something that DC might want to think about doing more in, is reducing many of the fees and fines related to the juvenile justice system. And so if we're thinking about people who are younger, not having that follow them as they're going forward.
What kinds of fees and fines do we have in the juvenile justice system?
We have that listed.
Like how much?
Yeah, just some examples of what we.
I'm trying to figure out.
For whatever it's worth, which is probably nothing to the pennies on the dollar, but DC Public Libraries, when I served on the board, we eliminated all fines, even eliminated all fees with zero. And we went through a thing of, so a low-income family is hoarding books in their house. How strongly do we feel about that? And it's spending somebody's library card with the old rules. Just didn't do it. So now, and since we did it, there's been no increase in my book.
Yeah, well, yeah, that is good. So if we go to the next slide, we're going to do this fast and try and get through, and then we can talk. Whatever can talk. So part of this is getting back to Mayor Williams' question, like, how does this fit into what you're doing with the Tax Revision Commission, right? What we're talking about, right? Part of it is you can think about specific fines, fees, and charges that you can consider for elimination or reform. And also just thinking about what it means for us to be dependent on this when we're thinking about the whole system of revenues and how we raise revenues in the district and what that means for racial equity. And figure out whether the fine or fee that we have, is it to change behavior, or is it to increase revenue, and is that what we want to be doing? And then thinking about whether there are smarter ways of collecting or changing the fines and fees that may make it cheaper to collect the money and not necessarily harm people in the process. So there are lists. We have a few listed here. Like, so some of the things that we talked about would be some of what we're talking about. So we could either decrease the base amount, or we can make it based on income. So you can basically have your tickets lowered based on the amount of income when you're first interacting with the system to pay those tickets. We could eliminate late fees, so not have them double if you don't pay right away. And other surcharges, there's a 20% surcharge if it becomes delinquent. But like ways that we can try and address the financial inequities and make it more affordable, so it's not just a flat fee. The central collections unit is how DC collects things. It seems like it might be more effective than other places, at least from what I've seen in places like Alabama. But we could do things like eliminate the late fee, reform payment plans, and basically, if we can expunge debt once it gets past a certain point, and we don't think that people are going to pay it after we get out 2-3 years. Court fees we can reduce and eliminate. Street parking fees, we could vary what your residential parking permits cost based on what ward is or what the income is in your ward. Maybe it should be more expensive in wealthier districts. That will raise mine. We're going to talk about clean hands later, but part of it is there is this push me, pull me, where if you can't, like if you can't enforce that people pay the things, the fact that we might have some of these clean hand laws that go into the business permitting and other things might be a way of trying to get people outside of the district to pay their tickets or pay their fees, but it could be making the system really onerous for people who live here, right? So part of it is just sort of understanding the incentives and how it all fits together. There are other things that could also be reformed in terms of things like child support payments and other parts of the fee system that we're not going to talk about, and I'm going to stop there.
Thank you, Kim. Erica, do you want to jump in? And then we have a pretty limited amount of time for questions, because I want to make sure we have time for our second presentation with on tax expenditures. Say again?
Go ahead, Erica.
No. I wasn't trying to cut off Erica. I was saying Erica should have full shot at asking questions, but then we may need to move on after that.
Well, I guess one question I put forward, one question, maybe one suggestion. So one question is, Kim, you talked a lot about sort of progressivity and racial equity related to fees and fines and ways we might do reforms. I wonder if you have any thoughts on whether there are like resilience or competitiveness arguments around why we should reform fees and fines. In addition to that, the other thing I was just thinking about is whether or not we might want to, as a commission, talk with the Council Office on Racial Equity about how to like evaluate some of the changes we think we might want to make to just, test out the theory, like the thing you said about the parking tickets and like them being valued at different levels depending on what part of the city they're being sort of given out. Like on face, that's in some ways that sounds like, yeah, that might be.
I feel like having them come be part of the conversation would be great. They were, full disclosure, we sent them
the tickets, right?
On the
Did I
ticket,
cut out? So anyway, like it might be good to have like a partner in helping to think through some of the different reforms and whether or not we're getting it right, because it does seem like there are a lot of potential sort of unintended consequences of some of these changes.
And I think that's right. I think on the competitiveness, it was surprising to me how much more expensive tickets are in the district than they are on average in Virginia and Maryland. Do I know whether anybody is changing their behavior? Like,
Are they not coming into the city for fear of getting a ticket?
or like,
Let's be honest.
but it is the case that ours are much higher than theirs. And I don't know whether part of it is to try and influence behavior, but
I find what's lacking in this is, I think Jim raised this question, is we don't know who's not paying. So for example, with the ambulance fees, I'm just assuming that if you're uninsured, you're not gonna end up paying, okay? And what you don't want to do is eliminate the ambulance fees for all the insured people whose medical coverage will pick it up.
so the part of it that I don't know is whether you don't pay it, you might not pay it, but I don't know whether it's not gonna end up showing up as debt on your record, right? So,
The ambulance fees are not. I can tell you that. So I just think it's the same thing with parking, who's not paying. And so you end up providing relief that's not.
and I think that's fair, and I feel like,
Yeah, and so it's hard to grapple with this for that reason. I don't know where the relief is actually gonna go. You may end up giving relief to the people who pay a lot, and they might be wealthy people.
so that would argue for trying to get some ability to pay in there, but like if we're doing things where we're differentiating between sort of what parking permits cost based on sort of average income in different wards, or even, if we get into sub-ward areas, that might be a way of recognizing that, the residents in certain districts.
It's nuts. I'm sorry, that's just nuts. Because on my block, we've got residents who've lived there for 50 years, who are there because of senior, tax privileges, right, that we support. And she may rely, and I'm not going to mention her name, on her Ward 2 parking sticker that takes her back and forth to her doctor's appointment. And so now all of a sudden, she's going to be paying based on what I make. Okay, you've got pockets of poverty in affluent parts of the city. You have them in Ward 1, you have them in Ward 3. People don't consider it, but it exists.
So then you could think
Meanwhile,
that,
you have wealthier community enclaves in some of what are traditionally our lower income, viewed as lower income communities. Whether it's a Penn Branch or a Hillcrest, you're going to have upper income communities within. So shouldn't they pay? And so.
okay,
and
so
what
then
I-
maybe having an ability to pay
What I'm reacting
option.
against is this notion that we are going to divide ourselves into these esoteric issues of who can and who can't. There will be some government bureaucrat deciding whether you apply or you don't. That seems to me a road to serfdom. I just cannot buy into any of that.
Part of it
Yes,
is,
I just think the impact and the overall scheme of what we're talking about relative to the complexity and amount of time it would take to think this through is really skewed. There are much more bigger questions about property and income and other taxes that have a huge impact, that are actually easier to grapple with than all of this. I don't know, I wouldn't spend much more time on it.
and I think that's fine. I would point out, though, that there are other places that have been able to do things that are relatively straightforward, like what California has done with the My Citation system, that is automated, putting in an ability to pay on traffic fines and fees.
Can I ask a very serious question?
Yes.
I am sympathetic to people who make mistakes, but who get themselves, because I do think our system is punitive, and it's punitive to everybody. So to simply say, well, it's less punitive to you, or maybe we should interject, it's punitive to everyone.
But
This
it's
is-
more affordable for certain people than others.
So there with, if there is a way, and by the way, that's life. Okay, that's just life. And, I'll just use myself as example. I came from a very low income family, and you know why we had to play by the rules? Because the costs of not playing by the rules were greater. And anytime the government steps in and tries to level playing fields, they're not going to level the universe.
But-
I can't let me finish. And so there
Okay,
is.
we're getting into
Okay.
a broader debate on public
All
health.
right, the thought,
Okay.
Mayor, the last point I want to say, I'm open to the idea of having some place to go where people could appeal. That is a process where they could appeal because of hardship, as opposed to it being automatic. That I would support.
And the part of that that sort of ignores the fact that we have a history of structural racism in this country, and certain populations have a much more
We got the-
problematic.
We got the argument.
Okay.
Thanks very much.
All right, sorry.
Thank you. No, it was great. Thanks
Okay.
for all this research and material. We will come
Like
back
to-
to this topic. Do you have, okay.
No, this is, you're raising your hand.
No.
All right,
Okay.
we're gonna,
How much revenue?
Small.
So it is a small percentage of the revenues, but the fact that we're about to implement new cameras that may further,
How much for the gross revenue?
451.4 million, right?
that is all non-tax revenues. Now, I would say it's like if we thought that it's about $200 million.
It's on the first, there's a table on the first slide of the.
I mean, do we collect that?
This is what we collect.
Charge.
No, that's what we collect.
Okay. Keep rolling. Good discussion.
Okay.
All right. More to talk about there than I should. All right. Now we're gonna switch gears wildly. Richard is gonna take us into the wild and wonderful world of tax expenditures, a tax policy jargon term, sometimes described as spending through the tax code. DC has and does the Office of Revenue Analysis. I really come to appreciate how much work they do in documenting all of the tax expenditures that DC has, but actually tackling them and figuring out what to do about some of them and how to assess them and when to scale them back is another topic entirely. So Richard, I'll turn it over to you.
Sure, and you want me to just bowl through this so we can then get
Yeah,
to a limited
Yeah,
time?
why don't we do it differently from the last conversation? Let
All right.
Richard get.
Yeah, so pick up
Slides then.
case. So again, as always, thank you so much for letting me come to these conversations. It's always a huge honor. I'm gonna go over what are tax expenditures,
Come on, everybody.
which are far more nerdy, but hopefully just as contentious as fines and fees. I'm gonna explain the major tax expenditures of the district, and then finally just give you hopefully some language and ability to talk about these during your later policy debates. Because what a, next slide. What a tax expenditure is a special provision that reduces tax payments for specific groups or activities. And so as Nick said at the very beginning, you have been discussing tax expenditures in this room in every single meeting. It's almost at the core of the very work that you're doing and considering what are the ones we like, what are the ones that we think are failing, and how do we want to make changes. These include tax abatements, tax deductions, tax exclusions, exemptions, and preferential tax breaks. As Nick was saying, we call them tax expenditures because many function the same as government spending. So for example, when we talk about housing tax expenditures, that is as much, if not more, about housing policy than it is about tax policy. It's about doing housing policy through the tax code. This is where this gets hard though. Are tax expenditures good? Are they bad? Depends on what you're asking and how you answer. Okay, because we will often hear them maligned as tax loopholes and special tax breaks. And something that we've probably said in this room is what we want to do is we want to broaden the base and lower the rate. We want to take out the expenditures and lower the tax rate. That's all good, and those are worthy goals that I've endorsed. But let's be clear, most tax expenditures go to policies that are very popular, and a lot of them work really well. And that's why there's this constant tension about how do we get rid of them, but how do we keep the ones that we like, that we think are doing a good job. One final thing to keep in mind, tax expenditures are a little bit like entitlement programs. They will sit in the code until they are removed. And so that's why they come up in these kind of conversations to make sure we're thinking about them and analyzing them. Next slide. Okay, so just again, a big part of what I want to do here is just leave you guys with the language and the tools to have these debates later on. So I want to do a quick primer on what's what, because these can get confusing even to tax terms. An exclusion or exemption means that something isn't taxed. So, on your DC income tax, if you have Social Security income, it's not taxed. It completely isn't put on the tax code. Same thing for a church. A church has value, but it's wiped off. It's excluded. There's no tax on its property. When you go to the grocery store and you buy food, no tax. Now, if you buy paper towels, you have some. That's because the food has been taken, it's excluded from your tax bill. Meanwhile, a deduction lowers what's taxed, your taxable income or the value of a property. So two really good examples. If you take the standard deduction, let's say you earn $50,000 in income, you get a $12,000 standard deduction. Well, that means only $38,000 of your income is going to get taxed. Similarly, if you own a $400,000 home, you get a $75,000 homestead deduction. Only means $325,000. So it's lowering the amount of what we're taxing. Then there's a credit. Credit happens at the end of the process, where you compile the value or you compile the income, take your deductions and you lower it and you get a tax bill. And then that credit, let's say you owed $1,000, but you have a $100 credit, that lowers what you actually are paying. An abatement is similar to a credit, but it's only going to be property taxes. And we typically do those by saying you're going to get 20% off your bill. And then a preferential rate just means we're taxing different things at different levels. And so when you do your federal taxes, if you have wage income, you can pay upwards of 37%. But then you have a separate place where you put in your capital gains income. And now that's coming in at 20%. That's just the government has decided there's an advantage to incentivizing or promoting that type of thing. So we're going to tax that at a lower rate than your other types of things. All right, moving on. As Nick was saying, and as I always like to do, I want to give ORA all the credit for the work it does, because it produces tons of paper on tax expenditures, including a tax expenditure report that goes over estimates for the revenue loss of all the tax expenditures in DC, that articulates how the expenditure works and describes basically the function of why it's here. But recently they've gone beyond that. They've begun publishing documents on the efficacy of tax expenditures. So if you read all 300 pages of the tax expenditure report, which I'm sure everyone in this room has done, you will get to a tax expenditure and it'll say, this is for home ownership. We know that home ownership has problems and therefore we enacted a tax policy. And then it'll say it costs X in revenue. What these new reports are doing is trying to get at, but did it work? Did it actually incentivize the housing we want? Did it help the people we want? That actually takes more time. That takes more 300-page reports that you've also read, but have definitely become a huge advantage to policymakers. And I again want to give credit that we're the Pew Charitable Trust was studying this, has specifically cited the districts for evaluations, providing clear histories, concise findings, and recommendations for how to do this better. Long way of saying there's a lot of stuff that can help our conversations and hopefully influence these conversations. So, what you actually want to learn about. What is in DC? What are DC's tax credits? We have over 200. There are a lot. That's why their report is so big. But not all of these were created by the DC Council. They were not all the result of people sitting down and saying how we're going to tackle a problem. In fact, a lot of the really, really big ones are historical or required by law. Most obvious example, all that federal property in DC has value. None of it can be taxed. Not allowed, even if we wanted to. This is not going to happen. So, for example, there's roughly $1 billion in revenue that does not go to the district government because we are not allowed to do it. Similarly, when the federal government buys stuff, they don't pay sales tax in DC. So that's another $350 million that we're never going to see. Then there's the traditional stuff. For example, there's a $160 million that we're not getting for educational institutions, places of worship, $75 million, charities, $15 million. This is like I said, there's a history here. You could probably read books about it. The general theory of this stuff is that these things are producing some sort of value. And so there's no need to take the tax for them. That what they are, the university, the church, they are given something to the community that is in place of its tax. Again, that's possibly contentious. We can get into it later, but that's why this happened and why it happens across the country. Okay, we take all those off the board. The rest are what we're going to call federal tax expenditures and local tax expenditures. And we go to the next slide. This technical difference, next one, is important because a lot of the income tax expenditures, both individual and corporate, were not made by the DC Council. They're made by Congress. And what happens is that, so for example, when all of you did your tax returns, you do federal first. And then when you go to do your DC return, it says, what's your AGI? And you transfer that over. Well, when you do that, you transfer over all those deductions and exemptions that were part of your federal return. And now, I don't want to, this passes as nefarious. This is actually, it helps you
you don't have to redo your tax return all over again. It helps government administration because it means the IRS can do a lot of the lifting on understanding your income, exemptions, deductions, et cetera. But what it does mean is that a lot of expenditures in DC in the tax policy center found 72% of individual and corporate income tax expenditures were the result of what we call federal conformity. And that's just using federal laws in the DC tax code. And there are good arguments for this, makes things simpler, easier to administer, but there is no rule that DC ever has to use a federal law. DC has and will continue to decouple from rules that either don't fit their values or don't fit their budget. This is kind of a boring one, but a very simple thing to keep in mind. You do your taxes. If you itemize, you get to deduct the income tax you pay in DC. Now, when you go over to your DC tax, you take your AGI, but it asks you to put that back in because the DC government has said, no, this is not a federal rule that we want as part of our tax code. And there are a myriad other examples where DC can say, no, we don't want this on ours, we'll do something different. Okay. As for the local ones, the ones that the DC Council has enacted and decided that should be, tax breaks, tax expenditures. On the next slide, we have, this affects everything. Right? If DC has a tax, it can create a tax expenditure. It can create an exemption. It can create a reason for why someone should not pay the full or partial of that tax. Some of these are very long-standing. Again, like those exemptions for churches, that's a local decision. DC made that decision, even though pretty much everyone does it. And then there's also just consensus. Basically every state does not tax grocery food. A few do, but by and large, most exempt that because they think that it's a fairness and a simplicity thing to not charge people for when they buy food. But there's still a ton that could have
Some
problems.
states charge sales tax on food.
It's now we're down to 8 or 7 out of 45.
Mississippi, Alabama.
Like Mississippi, Alabama. Yeah, I don't know how you guessed that one, but there are a few that just are holding on. But yes.
That is cold, man.
Okay, but again, so while there are, while this group was you guys were created to go through this stuff and think about this critically. There's a lot, and I will get to recommendations later. There are some stuff that we can do. I do think something that I always want to tell policymakers is that sometimes people will say, we gave up billions in tax expenditures, and if we got rid of it, we could cut our tax rate in half. Again, let's do the work, but let's remember that the big ones are stuff like the grocery food, EITC, homestead deduction, property tax circuit breaker, the real big ticket items, stuff that people like and that probably we think was working. Next slide. Again, specifically for DC, this is based on that ORA study that took an even finer look at this. It grouped tax expenditures. And so the biggest group was social policy. These include property tax exemptions for nonprofit organizations, churches, and charity. The next group was housing policy, which is the homestead deduction. Again, that's the one that lowers the value of taxable property. And then other efforts at supporting affordable housing. Education tax expenditures for 140 million. That was both property tax exemptions. It's mostly property tax exemptions for educational institutions, but there's also stuff for college saving plans and the public charter school tax rebate.
Where are the hospitals?
Hospitals would probably be in social policy. They'd be lumped in with the nonprofit. You don't know that's. Let me restate that. Let me be honest. I don't know. I think they are in social policy, but I also believe in sometimes health is broken out.
8 of our cities.
Did you have a growth number on the 529 account?
I don't, and I would if we could just put a pin in that, because I think that is going to be something that we're going to return back to in detail. But I think it's smart to kind of point it out. Income security, this is basically the earned income tax credit plus the local exemption for Social Security. On your taxes, a portion of your Social Security is taxed federally, but in DC, it all gets wiped away, none of it's taxed. And then economic development, 30 to 60. I want to make sure I point out this fluctuates a lot based on what the DC Council is doing and who's claiming it. The gist is that we are trying to attract, for example, high-tech firms, supermarkets, businesses that we think are having positive effects on the district, hiring people, creating economic activity. And next slide. Left. Are tax expenditures worth the money? Good question. That's why we're here. It's tough. We can ask the questions.
That's what we're paying the big.
Yeah, working overtime. You know, I think the first thing is, you know, does it achieve its goals? The reason tax expenditures are popular is, and not signaling anyone out, because I know we have a few politicians in the room, you often get a problem, and it's really, really tough, and it's hard to solve, and you go, well, what if we give a tax break for it? And then you say, I did something. That's fine, but let's make sure, did that actually achieve the goal that we said it was doing, or is it now just a line item? Related, you know, is there a policy out there that can achieve this better? Maybe if we worked harder and took it out of the tax code and did it another way, we could get the results we wanted. And is this even necessary? Are we duplicating policies that we also already have? For example, in the reports, ORA talks about how they did a really good deep dive into the qualified high technology company tax incentive program. And, you know, they found that like it wasn't being taken by that many firms, but a handful were taking a lot. And so the DC Council saw this and said, well, that's not actually what we want this to do. And so they put limits on who you can get so that we didn't just have a few firms taking all the money and gave it a better shot to achieve its goals. And then again, like, you know, I said this overall, the low, you know, broaden the base, lower the rate, that is a cliche, but it's also for a good cause because, you know, there are policy goals we can achieve by lowering tax rates. And a good way to do that is to reduce expenditures to give you the revenue to allow you to bring those rates down and achieve other tax policy goals. Next slide, please. Want to pause for a minute on just tax expenditures and racial equity. Something to keep in mind, like, again, we talked about how there's exemptions. You don't tax anything or you deduct it, you lower it. For certain sources of income and wealth, these are going to disproportionately benefit white households and specifically high income white households. For example, benefits that help retirement income. There's a lot of that in the federal code, and then there's some add-ons in the DC code. Okay, these are by the way this works is going to help people with more retirement income. That's just if you earn more retirement income over the course of your life, you're going to get a bigger savings from that. Okay, and so people who had higher income jobs had better savings accounts. They're going to get more benefit from this policy.
And to say, but what is retirement income?
It could, so it's a range, so there's a bunch of stuff in the tax code, like there is Social Security, but there's also like 401k plans, there's pensions, exclusions, IRAs, so myriad examples of this, and I'm just saying, the more you made, the better you did, the more you got, the more you can benefit from the taxes, just because that's.
The reason I raised that, before you did do 401k, put it in real estate, and you get retirement, that's not, yeah. But your other income is your 401k. The same income, that's why I'm asking for the definition.
Unless you have it in a REIT that you put in a retirement.
Yeah.
A REIT, so if you're like, you could put real estate into retirement accounts through different funds.
Mm-hmm. But, so again, going back to the racial equity lines, basically white houses are far more likely to have accrued retirement income or sizable retirement income than black households. Now, let me be clear. That does not mean retirement benefits and tax expenditures for seniors more broadly are bad policy. It could be really good policy. It could be very effective policy that is achieving goals that we really wanted to achieve. But it's just something to keep in mind that you might have, you know, disparate effects of who's benefiting from what policy, even though we're putting them all in the same bucket. And again, to be clear about what are we trying to achieve and why are we trying to achieve it with this thing specifically. The flip side of this kind of is when we're talking about benefits, specifically to low-income households, we talk a lot about refundable tax credits. That, like, so for example, like if you only earn like $20,000, you don't have any taxable income because you're a married couple, deductions aren't going to do you any good because you're already at zero. But a refundable tax credit, if you're eligible for it, can still provide a benefit. And then just broadly speaking, refundable credits disproportionately benefit non-white households. Next slide. So options, policy ideas, what we want to talk about in here. If you go through the ORA reports, they do put out some policy recommendations, a few that I plucked, ones that would reduce revenue, cut taxes. They mentioned expanding DC's EITC to reduce the marriage penalty for childless workers. This is one where we start with the federal law. There's a very narrow range for how you can benefit from it, like stops at around $20,000-ish. And it doesn't matter if you're single or married. So if you go from one household who's benefiting, gets married, all of a sudden you earned out. So you could extend the income range so that getting married, you could keep that benefit. Another is increasing the deductions public teachers get for buying classroom supplies. They just basically found that I think it's like a 250 deduction you can get, but the average teacher spends something like 750. So it'd be a way to assist teachers. As for tax increases, revenue raisers, DC could decide to limit Social Security benefits for certain households to not exempt at all. They could include clawbacks for economic development and housing projects if we find that the companies or the individuals aren't meeting the goals that we laid out for them. Or we can place caps on what you can claim, either annually or over one note that I feel like, I don't speak for Glenn, but there was a common theme through all of these, and I thought this was interesting and smart, is that we can just do better with data, because again, we keep this in tax world, but it's actually a housing policy. And then you go, well, did this work? Well, no, you got to go talk to housing people. You got to go talk to the business people. We talk about economic development. Well, who's collecting that data? How do we know? And trying to get more of this under one roof so we can keep a better eye on what's going on, and not just the revenue we're losing, but what we're achieving through the policy. And I think this is our last one. I wanted to just throw a few more out there, again, to give you ideas. But please keep in mind, again, this is something we're going to talk about in almost every meeting. No way exclusive, but some stuff that we possibly talked about, which are in the tax expenditure umbrella. Tax abatements for office to residential conversions, the proposal from Mayor Vallier. That would be a new tax expenditure that would cost money. Similar, DC FBI has advocated for a DC child tax credit, new expenditure helping DC families. On the increased revenue raiser side, again, just throwing this against the wall. We could eliminate or reform certain tax expenditures, and thankfully the staff is trying to compile those options for you. We can place caps or limits on local income tax benefits based on the filer's income, although note, there is already a phase out for itemized deductions on your DC return if you earn above $200,000. Or we can place time restrictions on the expenditures, which would basically force the DC council to say, yes, I like this, let's keep it going, or no, I do not think this has met its goals and will expire. Okay, with that, I will turn it back over to you.
Richard. Yeah, I mean, one thing maybe, can you talk a little bit, I mean, ORA's list of tax expenditures is a little bit, there's some judgment calls involved, right, in deciding what's a tax expenditure and not a tax expenditure. And I feel like there's, the ORA reports don't get at a lot of the tax breaks that go say, if you accrue unrealized capital gains, right? There's really good reasons why we don't tax unrealized capital gains, but those don't show up as a formal tax expenditure, right?
Would that be a federal one? That we just
Yeah, exactly. Federal government doesn't do it, and so.
That is, I do not believe that's in the report, but I don't know what would it be involved in trying to estimate that, and. Yeah.
Well, I'm reacting to you, you identified sort of where we have big tax expenditures, in social policy, for instance, in housing policy. There are also big swaths of the tax code where for various reasons, we don't tax certain kinds of, we don't tax unrealized capital gains income, kinds of financial income.
Yeah.
And I'm pretty sure that those don't actually show up, aren't in the list as.
But it's just money that you haven't made. It's just
Say again?
paper money,
Paper money.
right? That can go up and down. from
That
that
hasn't,
to that.
right, that you haven't realized yet.
Right.
I mean, economists consider it income, so it could be, that's.
So it's not income until you have it.
But this goes to like with these studies, I think the study has to claim what is the normal tax system. And if one person says a normal tax system would tax capital gains every year, but another person says no, a normal tax system would not tax the capital gain until it's collected, you would have two different reports. And so my guess is that the federal government says the normal system is no, that is not income until you claim it. And so it's challenging for DC. I mean.
And
Yeah.
the place where this shows up, I think, at the federal level, and I'm not sure if it shows up in DC, is you could look at something like this step up in basis, right? So when we talk about this, the fact that there's all this unrealized gains, and then somebody dies, and we just don't ever tax it if it sort of, we just increase it. And so I feel like there's been some studies that look at that, which seems like a more tractable way.
Yeah.
of
Sorry,
trying.
I guess a little off track.
Oh,
The other point is, can you just say real quick about sunsetting tax expenditures? Do you happen to know, are there jurisdictions that systematically allow tax expenditures to expire after a certain amount of time if required that they get reviewed?
I mean, if you'll allow me to be flip, I mean, like, yes, I don't have examples.
Yeah.
Because this is a thing that it's, I mean, it's not perfect. It's like a lot of, expenditures you want, especially if we're talking about business, you want the business to know that it's gonna be there. But then alternatively, I think I think a consensus among like do-gooder types is like that can't be an open door. And you can't be allowing one or a couple businesses to just take it all, and use it up. And so by putting either a cap on what an individual can take, or sometimes they just say, you guys can all come in, but there's only $10 million here. Doing something to limit the ability, to restrict it is an emerging and popular idea.
I have a couple of questions. So first of all, you say on page, whatever the hell it is, 5, you're saying, in addition, ORA publishes a deep review of expenditures on a 5-year cycle. Number 2 bullet, these reports analyze the efficacy of the tax expenditure and not just the revenue costs. But then you're saying we don't really keep track of the performance impact of these expenditures. So where's the rub there?
No, good decision. I think what the reports tried to say is that, like, man, this was a lot of work. And like, it takes so much time and effort. I feel like there's even one line where it says like, it was a lot of work, but it was actually good for us to have to go out and have these conversations with other government administrations.
It's not really getting at the performance efficacy. Like the district, what I'm trying to say is the district we may not like them ourselves, but actually the district is the leader in keeping performance data on government expenditure. We don't do that for these. Like, we don't say so many units of housing were produced by the Housing Production Trust Fund, for example. No, okay.
no. However, I have worked in other jurisdictions on tax expenditures that were specifically program achievement oriented. So if a firm did not hire a certain number of people, then they had to refund the tax breaks they had, or have a certain amount of capital investment in a building that was receiving a benefit. So they can be structured that way. If you will.
Within that policy thing, Housing Production Trust Fund is trying to produce X number of units.
I don't know that.
There could be.
Yeah.
So what are the major this is related to the whole question of, which gets to administration, not just design. What to you are the major drivers of, like, America has a much more complicated tax system than other countries, right? United States?
Generally speaking, I would guess a lot of countries use sales taxes, value-added taxes
Yeah,
as
so
the
we
biggest
have-
drivers, yeah.
It's because of the social benefits in our tax system, right? So a lot of the places that have very simple taxes, their social programs are totally separate from their tax filing.
Okay, so because we have included programmatic elements in our system at different levels of government, they tend to be more complicated. Do you, as a tax professional, are you kind of agnostic as to whether public policy should be pursued through classic expenditure versus tech expenditure? Or do you have an opinion?
Speaking personally, not representing the Tax Policy Center and my colleague, I'm like a bit of a path dependency guy, like we've got here. And I would like to know where we turn next, more than what would the best system be if we could throw it out, And I think, as you're saying, we have made decisions.
One other question.
Yeah.
And I'm not picking on any one university, and this is not my preference, I want to be clear, I am not saying this as a preference myself, but just for information purposes. Some nonprofits are federally excluded from us, and others are included by DC. The universities, for example, their land, is that excluded by DC or the federal government, do you know?
I want to say that's a DC decision. I think it's.
Some of our nonprofits, like the National Geographic issue, that are
I know
federal
that,
chartered.
but I'm saying
Yeah.
the universities are mostly DC.
Like, I know, like, the federal government buildings, like, no, you cannot, no matter how bad you
Got
do
that, I
it.
got
But I think, like, with the universities, there's some discretion. It's just always, it's one of those, it's always been done.
Well, under some jurisdictions, education institution has a payment in lieu
Of
of.
taxes, yes.
I know of a large affordable housing, company that is supposedly affordable housing, that is a DC nonprofit, that is not headquartered here, doesn't have a single employee here, that uses the benefits of our laws. And so, and that, may be a one-off, but, just as we ask, and I do believe we should be looking at accountability for expenditures for, for business enterprises. Why can't we apply the same to larger nonprofits? In other words, that there has to be some evidence, some objective proof that you provided a public benefit. And so similar to what we do in our CDE program, where we require that your banking resources be housed, your bank accounts here, that's for purposes of community investment, or that your management reside here, or that a certain percentage of your employees are district residents. There are any number of ways in which, or you purchase some amount of goods off of the city's CBE list, something to qualify you. And this is not intended to be punitive, but just to have everyone have skin in the game. Is there any evidence or any place we can look at to do that? So yes, you get, large hospital or whatever, you get your nonprofit status. But you have to check these boxes to qualify objectively. We can't simply take your word for it.
And there have been hospitals have lost their nonprofit status for not providing.
I'm not talking about charitable care, which I appreciate. You know what I'm saying? I'm just saying, just generally speaking, and this issue may not be right for this commission, but going forward, having some objective standards that a nonprofit taking advantage of the city's laws could make some objective contributions to the well-being of the city that could be measured. That's all I'm suggesting, not punitive.
No, but I think I don't want to speak too much out of turn, Glenn, right here. The ORA reports do touch on this in the sense that you can add qualifications if you track it and if you report it. And you could decide that, for example, like you're saying, it is not just that we believe a benefit should be provided to those who own a nonprofit housing place, but who also XYZ employ, certain people or is based in, and you could ostensibly write the rule that way, because now you're almost changing what the expenditure is for and therefore changing the requirements.
But then you have to claw back, right? Kind of like what we do with economic development. If people don't hit.
That's right. Mm-hmm. I think that's exactly right. It's, I just for grants, I looked at some of the salaries of our largest nonprofits that are 7 figures. I'm not talking about small community-based organizations. I'm not talking about the neighborhood church. I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about some of our larger nonprofits that have considerable resources and have, reserves, et cetera. There just needs to be, it seems to me, it's a matter of fairness and impartiality. I mean, that isn't a matter of equity. That they be called upon to make some objective, defensible contribution to the well-being and the running of the city.
Is that a tax policy question, and how are we going to explore that? I mean, so doesn't affect the bottom line of the city necessarily. And if you take our implementation of First Source and the CDE programs as an indication of how well we monitor that, I don't think it'll go very well.
That's where places start doing pilots where they get the payments in lieu of taxes. If they're basically trying to say, we're going to contribute.
I have a question just about semantics, it doesn't really matter, but a tax expenditure is virtually everything that we've been talking about for the last 6 months.
Kind of.
So if you're lowering the deed and recordation tax today, is that a tax expenditure?
No, so again, this in a way this goes back to kind of like the esoteric conversation Nick and I are having. It's kind of like what you consider normal, but just because you have different rates doesn't mean there's a different income tax rate and a different sales tax rate, but that doesn't mean one is special. You kind of have to decide what is the normal system. And so if we have,
Say we recommend lowering personal income taxes across the board.
yeah, no, that would just be considered a rate going up and down. It's kind of like, the part of it was it's either for a certain type of activity or a certain group. So if you had one deed or recordation tax, but then say hypothetically, you gave a different one to the commercial to residential conversions, that different lower rate.
Gray area, and it seems like.
But he sees
Back
it
to
as,
David's point,
he sees it as an expenditure.
Nonprofit has $500,000 worth of cash coming in a year. That profit is exempt, they don't make any contribution. Is there a way, number of employees, some idea of how they could be taxed?
There are ways, and some could be, just taken away, their exemption. Some could be what David's saying, where you could put different qualifications to ensure that some pay. But then there's also just, you'd have to go around the problem. And so creating taxes based on your number of employees. It's just that now those come with other trade-offs and downsides and are, it becomes very.
No employees out, but some way to tax, to get revenue. If their profit is worth $10 million, they don't pay any.
The CEOs have seven-figure salary. Yeah.
It's maybe worthy of its own commission to study, to be thoughtful because of unintended consequences. And it's not intended to be punitive, it's intended to broaden. That's all. And to solicit benefits commensurate with the benefit they receive for the district. I'm a fan of having bank accounts in the district. Having them, for instance, in local banks, could be, community banks, could be, there are a number of ways that we can do it that I think should be subject to a separate discussion. But I'm not trying to penalize them. I'm just trying to get everyone pitch in.
Because, on the flip side of that is we pay them something. We pay for police, fire, safety people. And they get an income. That seems a little unfair. Okay.
Man, that is a conversation that is going on in every single city across the country. Is that you? But it's. I was just trying to say it's really challenging.
But hypothetically, if you wanted to do a per employee fee, like we discussed, I think at the last one,
Yeah.
then you could have a really, uncomfortable conversation of what's more important to us, the money we raise from it or the value of the charitable services you provide? And I bet you it would be the money.
But I think they was.
I mean, 'cause every-
Providing the government service.
Well, then let's raise the fee. I mean,
It's hard to objectify, isn't it, Gregory, like how much a particular nonprofit is benefiting us. It's so subjective. And we are applying objective standards to for-profit entities that are getting benefits, and I think we should. We have a number of employees, we have taxes, whatever. But what I'm suggesting is that there's, an introductory conversation on what kind of objective standards should accompany tax benefit status that inure to our collective community benefit that we can measure and say objectively, you have checked the box, deserve this benefit. That's all.
Erica has a question, I think.
Yeah. I'm wondering, and this might be a question for CFO Lee, just, Richard, you mentioned the in-depth sort of studies of tax expenditures and their efficacy, whether they're actually achieving the goal that they were set out to achieve. You mentioned one example. It strikes me we don't do these very often. So I'm just wondering if we know, like, how many deep dives do we actually do? How many tax expenditures have we actually covered? How long do they take? Does that have any impact? Like, are there changes being made based on that? I mean, maybe that was true with the QHTC, but anyway, I'd be interested in hearing a little bit more about like how much we're actually doing that or whether we should be doing more of that. And then separately, in terms of sort of clawbacks and sunsets, I mean, I know you said you didn't know how many or which states are doing sunsets, but I think it would be good for us to, I know it's hard to get best practices because nobody's really doing things perfectly out there, but it'd be good to have a sense of how common those are, where they're happening, with both, and like any good examples of clawbacks for different kinds of tax expenditures. A lot of the ones that I've seen are very much focused on abatements or other kinds of incentives that go to businesses for job creation. But we have a lot here in the district that are based on housing production or other kinds of goals. And so do we have examples of other types of, do we have different examples of clawbacks out there and how they're designed? I think those would be good things those would be helpful things. And I think that really, if we're going to focus at all on tax expenditures and our work, it should be about how we sort of, you know, put guardrails in place to make them more efficient, effective, that kind of thing, rather than, because I mean, a lot of this conversation that's happening right now, I think gets outside of tax policy in ways that, like, you know, this body is not really gonna tackle in a full real way. Like, I think those are good questions about nonprofits and about whether we can tax some of the property we're not taxing. But I just think those are potentially bigger questions that we're not going to be able to answer.
I mean, I'm more than happy to go dig into and come back with examples on sunsets and clawbacks and give you that information. I'm also happy to punt question on the reports.
Sure. You know, I can't speak to the past if we dive deeper into a particular expenditure. I do observe in the industry across the country, and it's corroborated by an article in Tax Notes about a month ago, which is a trade magazine for tax administrators, that there's far more clawbacks and sunsets in the last, before COVID, in the latter part of the teens, because there was a sense of, you know, old school way of giving an exemption for business and economic development that was, you know, a way to approach things in the 70s. We know a lot more. And the sensitivities of centrist politicians is they want to see that their money was used correctly. They being, as guardians of revenue streams and expenditures, that there's relatively more movement for this, and we can collect a lot more in a lot more detail than we could in the 70s and 80s. So I think I've observed, and I'm seeing anecdotally that others in the profession are saying they're far more common, clawbacks and sunsets. But I defer to the learned experts here.
I feel like if we talk to the Pew people, like I feel like Pew actually had a program to not only sort of study tax expenditures, but actually provided support to a lot of places to help them implement things that sort of help normalize and operationalize what it means to collect information about what the results are from economic, like that was specific about economic development. That wasn't all tax expenditures, but that might be a place to start where they actually suggested putting in these sunsets.
I'm interested in seeing.
And how
things.
about with the deeper dive studies? Have we done many of those, or has there just been the one that was mentioned?
What they did was they did starting about 5 or 6 years ago, maybe 7 years ago, because I think they missed a year or two because of COVID. They did, they sort of took all the tax expenditures and did like a fifth of them each year and tried to do deeper dives that were more analytic. They're pretty interesting reading in the sense that you get a sense of the analysts, the challenges that the analysts faced in teasing out the information that they needed to make good judgment calls on sort of which tax expenditures are working and to come up with new ideas. And it's not really, you know, it's not a typical role for ORA to be in there making policy recommendations. And I believe this is actually mandated by the council that they do these periodic reviews. So they've now done one cycle through all of the tax expenditures, and Richard was referencing sort of maybe the summary of kind of a look back at the 5 years. And they're now starting again. I think the analysts there feel like they've learned a lot about how to dig into these, but you know, it struck me that they were sort of orphan recommendations. I did go through all of them, and a lot of them appear on this list of policy options. A number of them come out of these reports, because otherwise they're just orphaned, because no one's reading these reports that we're spending district money to do analyses of tax expenditures, and then we're not digging into them unless we do it. So.
Okay. Thank you.
The idea is curious. 70% of the profits. And basically, require a spin on it. So I think if it's thoughtful enough for nonprofits with large but it's huge reserves, then that the category that is 30%. I think to me it's a simple thought. So I just wanted to say because it's not 100%.
The accounting world, it's called, economic, it's a gap. Accounting. So nonprofit status, it's just an accounting status. It's certainly not it's not an economic status. It's like a company can grade the accounting to show it's fairly breaking even. Actually, universities do this. Sure. It's just a structure of the way it works. So it's something to think about.
Just a comment, if we choose to move in the direction of adding to expenditures, some deductions, and there's, for example, exemptions, and there's a policy aim that's specific, I'd ask that my colleague Keith, that you're going to meet Keith Richardson, the tax administrator, be part of that discussion, because we would have recommendations of how you structure it so that reporting of people who's exempted or not exempted is really clear. We can set rules to say, you're getting this benefit, here's what you need to tell us. That we have the capacity to handle that in our systems.
Just heard from stakeholders that they would like it if policymakers consult this industry.
So real takeaway I'm getting is that the aggregate individual users incorporate how they're residents, usually what they do.
So I'll give you an example that you know well, which is every year you're required to file this form. Tax status on. You've got to check the box. And to be clear, I wouldn't be in favor of taking taxes status away from small organizations that are checking all these boxes. That seems counterproductive because it's resources away from other things to the good. Just as you have to certify that you are continuing to use that for nonprofit, it's self-certification. No accompanying proof that you've done anything.
Right.
You see what I mean?
So we have not clear enough. If we could structure other reporting responsibilities, then leave an audit trail for us to find an audit trail to validate.
Self-certification. 25% of our workers are district residents. We wouldn't do this overnight. You'd stagger
No,
it.
right.
Or that our directors and officers work in the district, or that bank accounts are in the district, that our headquarters is in the district, whatever those things might be. It may be subject to our suggesting to the council that they establish a separate task force on this, because it is so complex. And it would unsettle people's settled expectations in a way that could make people and to do it in a thoughtful way that doesn't move our boxes for the sake of doing it, going after nonprofit inks as opposed to the real nonprofits who can touch and see contributing to the labor. And I don't think on the board of it, I know where our employees live and where our bank accounts are and where our officers work. Any combination of that shouldn't be too high a burden, privilege of nonprofit status.
Mm-hmm. All I'm saying is let us design the audit trail and
Y'all, that's it. We are done for today. On that note,